The following program is brought to you by the University of Alabama.
What I'd like to do is talk through the handout. I'm going to talk about some big issues in philosophy of mind over the course of the past century with an eye toward what I think are important agenda items for philosophy of mind in the future. And I'm going to be bringing to bear ideas that have been important in my own work. And so this will be a kind of opinionated overview of the state of the art in philosophy of mind. I want to talk about, broadly speaking, a naturalistic way of thinking about the mind. This is very common in philosophy of mind. The idea that human beings are part of nature and that mind is part of nature. So what we need in terms of understanding mentality and understanding, for example, how mind connects to brain. There's a handout here. If you didn't get a handout when you came in, pass her a handout. It's important to think in terms of mentality as being a part of nature, naturalism in a broad sense. And an awful lot of what's been going on in philosophy of mind is to try to give a naturalistic conception of what mind is and how mind relates to the physical world, what the connection is between mental phenomena and what happens in the brain, but to do so in a way that doesn't distort the nature of mentality in order to kind of make the mental fit more comfortably into the physical. So we're looking at projects of naturalizing. Now, many who want to understand mentality as naturalistic, as part of nature, are inclined to think that if someone rejects that general idea about how to think about the mind, if they think of the mind as something over and above the world as described by science, then they're somehow committed to a mysterious and magical conception of mentality. Here's the generic way to think about a naturalistic conception of the mind. This is point A1 on the handout. The mind is part of nature, and so it's subject to the laws of nature. There aren't any non-physical substances or individuals in the world, such as Cartesian souls or entelechies. Descartes, the famous mathematician and philosopher, was famous for a dualistic, strongly dualistic view of the relation between mind and body. He held that the mind is a soul, it is a spirit, is a non-physical thing, and that a human being is a composite of non-physical, spirit-like mentality, the mind or the soul, and a body. And so the mind is a completely separate thing from the body and can survive the death of the body. I think a generic naturalist is going to deny that. Whatever mentality is, whatever mind is, there's no such thing as an immaterial substance or thing, a soul or a Cartesian mind. Entelechies, these were spirit-like things that were sometimes posited in the history of biology. The idea was that there's some very dramatic difference in reality between things that live and things that don't live. So there was a life force that somehow imbued itself into any kind of physical thing that is alive. Not just human beings, not just animals, but plants as well. Entelechies as certain kinds of immaterial things that combine with matter to give you a living thing. A naturalist, a generic naturalist, is going to deny that there are things like entelechies or things like Cartesian souls. So the things there are in the world, including things that are alive and things that have minds, are broadly speaking physical things. They are part of nature, they are composed entirely of physical parts organized in certain ways. So this is generic naturalism. That's a starting point. But now I think we can distinguish different kinds of naturalist conceptions, different versions of the generic approach. One is what can appropriately be called emergentist naturalism. And there's a history over the last, say, 150 years of emergentist thinking in science sometimes and also in philosophy. I would distinguish two kinds of emergentist views of the mind. They're both naturalist in the broad sense I just described. The idea is that there are certain basic and unexplainable connections between properties or features or attributes of the kind that are described by physics and chemistry, by the natural sciences, and other kinds of properties or attributes, in particular properties like thinking and experiencing. If you were an emergentist about life, you would also think that life properties are certain kinds of features or attributes over and above physics, chemistry type properties. And another thing that makes you an emergentist is that you think the connections between physics level and chemistry level properties on the one hand, and these higher level properties like mental properties. These are fundamental connections. They are basic, they're parts of nature. They are not explainable in other terms. So I distinguish two kinds of emergentism. One I call gnomic emergentism. The idea is that there are fundamental laws that link certain physical states of things to, for example, mental states of things. When you're a human being in a certain kind of overall physical state, including an overall state of the brain, then as a matter of law, you are in a particular mental state as well. There are fundamental law-like connections between physical properties of humans, for example, and other sentient creatures, and mental properties. That's gnomic emergentism. The well-known contemporary philosopher David Chalmers, as I understand him, is appropriately described as a gnomic emergentist. Another kind of emergentism is what I call Morean emergentism, after the important philosopher from the turn of the century, and he was writing in the early 1900s, G.E. Moore. And he wrote, maybe most famously, about the nature of the moral. And he held that there are fundamental, unexplainable dependence connections, interlevel connections between certain properties of things as described by natural science and the property of intrinsic goodness. He thought, for example, that pleasure is intrinsically good, and the fact that pleasure is connected to this property of intrinsic goodness is a fundamental, unexplainable fact. But the connection is not just gnomic, because it doesn't depend on there existing some particular law of nature that might have been different. The idea is that regardless of how the laws of nature might have been, it would still be a necessary and fundamental fact that if a being is in pleasure, then to that extent, this is a feature that's intrinsically good. So I'm using the phrase metaphysically necessary for this kind of connection between, say, natural science properties and mental properties. If you thought that mental properties were emergent in that sense, you'd be a Morean emergentist. You'd think it's not just a matter of particular laws of nature that connect, say, certain brain states to certain mental states, but something even stronger. It couldn't be otherwise, even if the laws of nature were different. So what makes you emergentist is that you think there are these fundamental and unexplainable connections between, for example, physical properties, brain properties, and states of mind. They are unexplainable. They are basic, over and above whatever other basic laws there might be, say laws of fundamental physics. Now that's a kind of view that dominant thought in recent philosophy of mind has wanted to reject, because the dominant approach has been not just naturalist, but also materialist. What do I mean by that? So now I'm point A3 on the handout. The idea, well, first of all, and negatively speaking, is that mental properties are not emergent. This is another species of generic naturalism, but it also wants to reject emergentism. There are two broad kinds of materialist naturalism. One is identity materialism. It says that mental properties are really just the same thing as physical properties. So, for example, what it is to be in a state of experiencing pain, or say experiencing some quite specific kind of pain, like say a particular kind of toothache, is the same thing as being in a certain specific brain state. The property of feeling this kind of pain is just identical to the property of being in such and such brain state. And likewise for all mental features, for all mental attributes. That's identity materialism, and it certainly has been popular in the past 50 years and has had a lot of advocates. On the other hand, a common objection that's made to identity materialism, and that is accepted by many who I would think of as still being materialist naturalists, is the worry that's often put in terms of the expression multiple realization. I guess I didn't put that on the handout. But the idea is that it seems entirely possible that there could be creatures who have different kinds of physical constitution than we do, say Martians. They have a mental life. Maybe they've evolved on Mars. Maybe they're made out of quite different stuff. Maybe they're made out of silicon. Maybe their physical composition is more like that of computers, or say robots with computer brains, even if they've evolved somehow. They're not physically like humans, and they don't have brains that are made out of carbon molecules and so forth, but they have a complexity of organization and a very complex repertoire of behavioral capacities that's comparable to that of humans. So the thought is it would really be chauvinistic to deny that a creature like that, for example, could have a belief, say the belief that 2 + 2 = 4. But if it's physically different from us, then that belief property, that mental property, believing that 2 + 2 = 4, would be physically embodied, physically realized differently in the Martian than in us. And so a more dominant way of thinking about the relation between the mental and the physical in recent decades, more dominant than identity materialism, is what I'm calling supervenience materialism. This is point 3b under item A on the handout. Supervenience is a word that's used for a relation of dependence between, say, physical properties of the brain and mental properties. Typically, it's thought of as a relation that's not identity. And one reason to be a supervenience materialist rather than an identity theorist is that you can then allow for the multiple realizability of mental properties. The property of believing that 2 + 2 = 4 as a mental feature of a creature could be embodied physically in different ways by different actual or at least possible thinkers. But the idea would be that if you're a certain kind of physically composed creature and you're in a particular state, a state that that kind of creature can be in, say a certain brain state in us, then there's a connection between being in that kind of physical state and believing that 2 + 2 = 4, a relation of dependence. That's what's called supervenience. Supervenience as a dependence relation. So the mental property is dependent on the brain property without being identical to it. And one reason to have dependence without identity, as I say, is that that allows for multiple realization. In different creatures, the same mental property could depend on some other kind of physical property. Well, though, the difference between a supervenience materialist and an emergentist is that the supervenience materialist doesn't think that these dependence relations are just fundamental and brute and unexplainable. I take it that part of what it is to be a supervenience materialist is to hold that mental properties and the connections between brain states and mental properties are explainable, and explainable in a scientifically respectable way so that they are not just brute. If you think they're brute, fundamental, unexplainable facts, then I think you're an emergentist. To be a supervenience materialist is to hold that supervenience relations are explainable in some kind of way that would count as kosher or acceptable from the point of view of someone who thinks that the only fundamental laws in the world and fundamental facts about things are facts and laws as described by the most basic sciences. Typically, people think about fundamental physics. So the word that I use for that is superdupervenience. By superdupervenience, I mean explainable supervenience. I think if you want to be a materialist supervenience thesis, if you want to advocate that, if you want to be a supervenience materialist, you should hold that the supervenience connections are explainable and not brute. Okay. So now let me move on to section B. I think that it's an important and difficult philosophical question. What counts as explainable supervenience relations between the physical and the mental? assuming that mental properties are not the same thing as physical properties because of multiple realization. What is it to have an acceptable materialist kind of position about the relation between the physical and the mental? I think that this is already a philosophically difficult question. And so I want to pause to talk about aspects of it that make it tricky. Point B1 is a point I guess I've already made about multiple realizability as a motivation for being a supervenience materialist instead of an identity theorist. So I'll move on to point B. What kinds of explanation anyway, and what explanatory resources would be okay to employ if you're trying to explain why it is that certain mental properties, like the property of believing that 2 + 2 = 4, depend the way they do on underlying physical properties, like a certain brain state? This seems to me to be actually a difficult nut to crack. It's a hard question to get your mind around. What kinds of facts can you help yourself to when you're trying to explain why it is that mental features depend the way they do on physical features? So look at point 2b, for example. 2 little b under big B on the first page. Facts about causal role essence of higher order properties. Are they okay to help yourself to if you're trying to explain the relation between a lower level property and a higher level property? Well, I mean, suppose it turns out that a certain substance is poisonous. And the question is, explain to me why this particular substance is poisonous to humans. Well, it looks, so there's a relation between, being a substance with this kind of chemical composition, for example, and being poisonous. There's a supervenience relation between being composed of this sort of chemical stuff and being poisonous. Well, it looks like one thing that would be legitimate to use when I'm explaining this connection is what the nature of poisonousness is, what the essence of poisonousness is, what the property is in its nature, what we mean by the concept of poison. So I could say, well, what makes something a poison is that it tends to be very harmful to the creatures that it's poisonous to do them bodily damage and or actually kill them. So I could appeal to that fact about what we mean by poison, for example, or about the essence of the concept or the property of poisonousness. So given that that's what poison is, then I could look at these physical, chemical facts about this substance and look at facts about how humans are built and give you a story about why it is that given our kind of physical constitution, ingestion of that sort of substance would be harmful to or would tend to kill humans. And that way I'd be explaining the supervenience relation between having this kind of chemical composition and being poisonous. So maybe we could do something like that when we're trying to explain the relation between physical properties and mental properties. Maybe we could try to give some kind of account of the essence of the property believing that 2 + 2 = 4. Maybe it would be legitimate to do that. And then given that fact about what it is to believe that 2 + 2 = 4, then maybe we could explain why it is that when a human being is in such and such brain state, they thereby have the property of believing that 2 + 2 = 4. But the general question here is what kinds of resources can we bring to bear when we're trying to explain supervenience connections? I think that's a philosophically tricky problem, and one that, in my own thinking, remains somewhat open. And so I think that that's an element of work to be done in the future, in the 21st century in philosophy of mind. One way of thinking about this whole issue of explainable supervenience relations is in terms of what I once labeled cosmic hermeneutics. This is an expression I introduced a good long time ago. What do I have in mind? Well, the famous mathematician and scientist Laplace, who I think lived in the 19th century and did a lot, for example, in the science of celestial mechanics. He did a lot in terms of explaining the orbits of planets around the sun, elaborating the explanations that are available on the basis of Newton's laws of motion. He was maybe one of the first to vividly characterize the thesis of determinism, the idea that the laws of nature are deterministic, which Newtonian mechanical laws are. In fact, I think they're deterministic in both directions, both forward in time and backward in time. And he put it in a very vivid way. He said, imagine an intelligence that's powerful enough that it can hold in its mind at one time a complete specification of the state of the world at one instant, where he was thinking of the state of the world in terms of the positions and velocities and masses of all the basic particles. Okay. And so the idea was, to this being, the whole future of the world, and in fact the whole past history of the world as well, would be present before its eyes. All this being needs is to hold in its mind a complete specification of the physical state of the universe at some instant in time, and it will know the whole future and the whole past, because we're imagining that this being knows the laws of motion from Newton and can instantaneously calculate, how things will evolve present and past. So that's a kind of vivid way of thinking about determinism. Well, I wanted to adapt this image of the Laplacian demon, as it's sometimes called, this being who can do this. And I thought about it this way. Imagine that the Laplacian demon, this kind of unlimited mind, can hold before its entire mind all at once a specification of the whole physical history of the universe. Everything that happens at the level of fundamental particles in terms of fundamental laws of nature, forces working on these particles. I say the whole history of the universe because the laws of nature and physics might or might not be completely deterministic. Some people think that the most appropriate way to interpret quantum mechanics is in terms of its being an indeterministic theory. So let's just set the issue of determinism aside by imagining that our Laplacian being holds before its mind the whole physical history of the world, which might or might not be ascertainable by just looking at an instant. That depends on determinism. But just take the whole history. The Laplacian has that. What would it take for the Laplacian being to figure out all the facts about the world? The facts as described in other terms than the language of physics. For example, who's thinking what, when, where there are institutions, where there is such a thing as public language, what the sounds that people emit when they speak mean, things like this. See, these are things that are not specified in the language of physics. But if you think that the only fundamental facts about the world are physics-level facts, as a materialist is apt to think, someone who is a materialist about philosophy of mind and kind of more generally a materialist about reality, then it looks like you should say that the Laplacian being should be able to figure out all the facts, just given the physical history of the world. But in order to figure out those facts, it looks like the Laplacian being would need to use some explanatory resources other than just the facts of physics as described in the language of physics. Maybe the Laplacian being would have to know something about what counts, what it would be to believe that 2 + 2 = 4, in order to figure out that at such and such place in the cosmos, at such and such time, there is a being there who is thinking that 2 + 2 = 4. Remember, the description of the world that the Laplacian being gets is entirely in the language of fundamental physics. So that's a way of posing this question of cosmic hermeneutics. It's called hermeneutics because you're kind of interpreting the whole fact, you're interpretatively figuring out everything about the world on the basis of a physical specification of the world. If you're a materialist, it seems that that should be possible in principle. But now we try to figure out what kinds of facts the Laplacian being could use to give these explanations about what the other facts are and why. Okay, so I think that this kind of issue is one that ought to be focused on a lot in philosophy of mind. What counts as a materialistically acceptable explanation of dependence relations between physics-level facts and other facts? I don't think that's a question that's been addressed enough, and I think it's actually a pretty important question. Okay, now I want to turn to a persistent kind of problem in philosophy of mind that's been around at least since the middle of the 20th century. I mentioned identity theory, for example. Well, let's go back up a bit. Let's do a little bit of history in philosophy of mind that takes us back, say, to the 1940s and early 1950s. There was a very important text published by the philosopher Gilbert Ryle at mid-century called The Concept of Mind. He advocated a kind of view that's typically called analytical behaviorism. The idea was that whenever we use mental language to say something about somebody, whenever we describe them in mentalistic terms, what we're really doing is describing their behavior, or perhaps their dispositions to behave. So if I say, for example, that you're clever at chess, what I'm doing is describing your dispositions to play chess very well. If not your actual playing of chess, at least your dispositional capacity to play well. The idea was that mental talk is not really talking about certain properties of you over and above physical properties of you. It's really talking about your behavior and your behavioral capacities. Stuart Rachels, who's in the philosophy department here, is extremely clever at chess. I guess he's given up competitive chess and now he's become a heavy-duty competitive bridge player. But yeah, he was pretty spectacular. How many people know about Stuart Rachels as a chess player? Not that many. Yeah, I mean, he was the youngest master in the United States. He held that record for a good long time. I think he became a chess master at age 11. And he tied for the U.S. championship when he was age 20, which made him the youngest U.S. chess champion since the legendary Bobby Fischer, who I guess became the U.S. chess champion when he was how old, maybe 14? So Stuart Rachels is very clever at chess. That was a bit of a digression, but many people were unsatisfied with Rylean behaviorism because they thought there are surely certain aspects of mentality that are not just a matter of your dispositions to behave in certain ways. There are certain mental episodes, there are mental happenings, mental events. In particular, they were thinking about sensations, experiences, sensory experiences. So the idea was that even if Ryle is right about certain aspects of the way we think and talk mentally, the way we use mental concepts and mental language, there's more to it than that. There's sensations. And so the early identity theorists were U.T. Place, Ullen Place, and J.J.C. Smart, publishing right around 1950. And Place wrote a famous paper called Sensations and Brain Processes. And the idea was that at least for those kinds of mental features, there really is something there. It's not just a behavioral disposition. There's a happening, there's a phenomenon, there's a process that you undergo when you have a sensory experience. The proposal, though, was that we should just identify that with a brain process. It's not like there's something mental that's a feature of you or an event in you over and above what's going on in your brain. The sensation is the brain process. Well, there was a problem, though, that Smart himself recognized. His famous paper was largely a matter of laying out objections to this identity thesis and then trying to respond to them. And there was one in particular that he took most seriously, that he thought was the hardest for an identity theorist to deal with. And his initial response to it was one that he later repudiated. He thought it was inadequate. And the idea was that even if you say that a sensation, say a mental episode, like an experience of pain, is identical to a brain state, you haven't gotten rid of mental properties as something apparently over and above physics-level properties. He called this the problem of irreducibly psychic properties. This is point C2 on the handout. Because many would say, well, how is it that you know you're in pain anyway? How is it that you're aware that that's the kind of state you're in now? You don't know anything about what's going on in your brain, at least if you're an ordinary person, and if you're not using some sort of fancy device that monitors the state of your brain while you're feeling a pain. But you know directly and immediately what kind of sensation you're in. Why is that? Well, it seems it's because there's a certain property that is had or exhibited or instantiated by the sensation, the what it's like property, the what it feels like property. And this what it's like property seems on its face to be something over and above what physics talks about. And that, it seems on its face to be how it is that you are able to know and know directly and immediately that you're in pain. You know that you're in pain because your being in pain exhibits this what its likeness property. And that what its likeness property, at least initially, looks like it's some kind of feature over and above what physics and chemistry talks about. So what about that? There's this residual worry that there's what its likeness to experience, and that what its likeness is not captured in terms of what physics and chemistry and natural science have to tell us. So that was the beginning of this problem of irreducibly psychic properties. It was there already for the early articulations of the identity theory. Now, I've already mentioned that one reason why the identity theory came to be less popular, was largely repudiated even by materialists in philosophy of mind, was the thought that mental properties are multiply realizable, at least in principle, but maybe in fact, maybe there are creatures that are physically different from us that undergo the same kinds of mental properties that we do. The kind of view that came to be dominant really starting in about the 1960s among materialistically minded people in philosophy of mind was called functionalism. This is point C3 on the handout. The basic idea of functionalism was that what makes a mental property the property that it is the kind of role that it plays. Its role is its essence. And the functional role that is definitive of a mental property is not just a matter of, say, of having a certain behavioral disposition. Ryle was sort of onto something, but from the functionalist point of view, his picture was too simple. The functional role that's definitive of a mental state involves its tendency to have certain behavioral effects, but also its tendency to be caused in certain ways, and also its tendency to interact with other mental properties, which also then are definable themselves in terms of their functional role. So pain, for example, is typically caused by damage to the organism and typically causes certain kinds of avoidance behavior. But it's only going to cause that avoidance behavior if the organism also is in another accompanying mental state or property, but the state of desiring for the pain to subside and so forth. So typically these mental properties have their roles in combination with each other, and their roles are a complicated matter of how they're all connected up with each other and with sensory inputs and with behavioral outputs. So that's a functionalist picture of the mind. And if the essence of a mental property is its role, its rolehood, then it could be physically realized in different ways. There could be a Martian that's built up out of different physical stuff than us, but that has physical states of it that play roles that are the pain roles, and play roles that are the belief that 2 + 2 = 4 roles. And so it could be in the same mental state as you and me, the state of believing that 2 and 2 is 4, even though physically it's in a different state. Now, if you're a functionalist like that, then I think you have a kind of natural and attractive strategy for explaining supervenience relations between the physical and the mental. You have a natural and attractive way to address the problem of superdupervenience. You say, well, the essence of being in a certain mental property is thus and such functional role. And then you say, given enough empirically discoverable facts about the physical constitution and nature of human beings, we find that this particular brain state plays that role. This is not something to be discovered from the armchair. This is something where the conceptual analysis part that is perhaps contributed by the philosopher kind of tells us what it is to be in thus and such mental state in terms of the defining functional role. But then the scientist tells us which brain state plays that role. And if we discover empirically that this particular brain state plays exactly the role that is definitive of believing that 2 + 2 = 4, that's why it is that whenever you're in that brain state, whenever a human is in that brain state, the human believes that 2 + 2 = 4. So the functionalist approach, among other virtues of it, among other attractions of it, is that it seems a kind of nice way to implement a materialist kind of naturalism about the mind. and give you a way to explain why mental properties are dependent or supervenient on brain properties in just the way they are. But the problem is this persistent and fly-in-the-ointment nasty worry about leaving out what it's like, leaving out the actual character, experiential character of your mental life. I talk about inverted qualia, absent qualia, Jackson's thought experiment. I won't pause to talk about what inverted qualia means and what absent qualia means. That's philosophy ease. But I do want to mention Frank Jackson's famous thought experiment about Mary the colorblind scientist. How many people have heard of Mary the colorblind scientist? I'm just curious about who here has exposed themselves to this kind of stuff. So Frank Jackson imagines Mary as a vision scientist who works in a lab, and she knows an awful lot. In fact, we kind of idealize to suppose she knows all there is to know about how the human color vision system works, and in fact how human vision works in general in terms of brain organization, functional roles of various parts of the brain, what happens in the visual cortex. And she also knows all there is to know that's relevant about the physics of color as well. Okay, she knows all that. She's an ideally brilliant and ideally well-informed scientist concerning matters of visual experience and concerning the physics of color. The thing about her, though, is that she's been colorblind her entire life. So in terms of her own experience, she's had various kinds of black and white experiences and various shades of gray, but that's it. Okay. So now you ask, is there something she doesn't know? Something that pertains to color experience that she doesn't know? And you're supposing by hypothesis that she knows all there is to know in terms of what goes on physically and functionally in the heads of humans when they're, for example, looking at colored things. She knows all the functional facts as well as knowing all the physics level facts. So if all there was to, say, having an experience of seeing red was being in a certain kind of state with a functional essence, it's typically caused by red things. It typically causes the experiencer to classify the things as red, so on and so forth. Then she knows all there is to know, because she knows all that functional stuff, and she knows the connections between what happens physically in the brains of humans when they see colored things, and the way that functional role properties are dependent on those physical kinds of features. But intuitively, it seems sort of obvious that there's something kind of important that she doesn't know, maybe doesn't have any inkling about, something that maybe she ought to be really dying to know. She doesn't know what it's like to see color. She's been colorblind all her life. And you imagine her for the first time, having an operation that gives her color vision. Or maybe they surgically implanted her with funny contact lenses before she was, when she was an infant, that filtered out all colored lights and all colored inputs. So now for the first time her contact lenses are removed. You're inclined to think she would go, wow, this is fantastic. So this is what colors are like. Well, the thought is that beforehand she knew all there was to know, physically and functionally. But there was something she didn't know. There was something that was left out by the physical level story, namely the what it's like of visual experience, of color experience. And this is often put forth as an objection to functionalism. Functionalism leaves out what it's like is like. And that's a really important element of full-fledged mentality. So that's a kind of a quick survey of the problem of irreducibly psychic properties. It's a problem that more recently has been labeled by David Chalmers as the hard problem of consciousness. What its likeness seems to be kind of left out of the standard materialist story about the mind. And how would you explain connections between what happens physically in the brain and or the functional organization of the brain and the particular kinds of what its likeness that come along with, that accompany various brain states? Chalmers' view is that these facts are not facts to be explained, that they are metaphysically fundamental. There are fundamental laws of nature that connect certain brain states and also certain functional states. to these particular what it's likeness, experiential states. And these fundamental laws are not themselves explainable in other terms. So that's why I said earlier, if you go back to point A on the handout, that Chalmers is a gnomic emergentist as I read him. He's not a naturalist materialist. There are various kinds of fancy wrinkles on functionalism that I and my colleague John Teenson have labeled New Wave Materialism. I think I'm not going to go into that, but the bottom line is that we think of the same problem arises for New Wave Materialism. The problem of irreducibly psychic properties is still with us and is still a big thorn in the side of attempts to implement a materialist view of the mind. Maybe I should just stop for a minute and say something about where I am myself concerning materialism about the mind. I call myself a wannabe materialist. I really do want to be a materialist about the mind, but I don't really see clearly how to be a kind of honest materialist about the mind, because it seems to me that the going stories, the kinds of attempts to give a naturalistic account of mentality that you find in philosophy of mind in the last 50 years, right up until the present moment, typically leave out what it's like is really like. It seems to me that they distort the nature of our mental lives as it's given to us immediately in our first-person experience. They leave out the intrinsic qualitative character of experience. And I don't think that an acceptable view of the mind should do that. So what I would like is a materialist naturalism that doesn't do that, but I don't yet know what such a thing would look like. So I don't actually have a settled position about this issue myself. I thought I ought to just stop and say that at this point, because it's not like I've got, as a grand punchline, my own answer to the worries that I'm now laying before you. I don't. I think that these are open questions that still need to be discussed. Okay, let me shift gears a bit now. Let's see, I've been talking for how long? Oh, I've been talking for quite a while. So I'm going to shift gears and say a few things very quickly. I didn't necessarily mean to talk through this entire handout. I've used this handout in various venues over the last 2 or 3 years. So let me move fast. Maybe I'll skip section D on phenomenal intentionality. That'll save some time. And move to section E and section F. Yeah. Mental causation, section E. I want to mention one issue that's been really actively discussed in recent philosophy of mind, and then a second one that hasn't been very much discussed, but I think should be. Both of these under the heading of mental causation. So first of all, E.1, the problem of causal exclusion. That's an expression that was introduced by my former teacher at University of Michigan, my former graduate supervisor, Jaegwon Kim. And the basic problem is this. Suppose you reject identity materialism, maybe because you think that mental properties are multiply realizable. That's a common reason, as I've said, for rejecting identity materialism. Then how do you avoid so-called epiphenomenalism about mental properties and mental phenomena? Epiphenomenalism is the view that although mentality is real, it really happens, it doesn't do anything. What happens in your mind has no effects on what you do, and doesn't even have any effects on what happens later in your mind, because the causal history of all of your behavior is a matter of what's happening physically in the world and happening physically inside of you. In particular, what's happening physically inside your brain, because your brain is controlling all of your behavior. So the thought is this: if mental properties are not the same thing as physical properties, if identity theory is not correct, then look, the right story about what causes you to do what you do is in principle a story that can be told in terms of the laws and principles of physics and chemistry. In principle, we could trace back everything you do, because behavior is a matter of coordinated contraction and relaxation of muscles. Verbal behavior is that too, coordinated relaxation and contraction of muscles in the throat and mouth and vocal cord. It's all a matter of physical phenomena in your body being caused by other physical phenomena in your body. And especially important here is signals that are sent by the motor cortex in the brain that control bodily motion. And those signals are themselves generated by higher level previous states of the brain. Experiential input is just a matter of physical bombardment of the body by sounds and light and so on. So in principle, the whole story about how humans behave in the world is a story that can be told in terms of physics and chemistry. So if mental properties are distinct from physics, chemistry type properties, maybe they're supervenient on them. Maybe you can even explain the supervenience relations so that maybe you could be a materialist naturalist. There's still this problem that mental properties look like they don't do anything. There's no work for them to do because the physics, chemistry level properties in your brain and central nervous system do all the work. That's the causal exclusion problem. A lot of ink has been spilled on that problem in recent philosophy of mind. My own favorite approach to that is to try to say that what counts as causation and causal explanation is not a kind of simple yes or no, doesn't matter what the context is type thing, but the whole idea of causation is connected in various subtle ways to features of context. So what counts as the cause, what counts as an appropriate causal explanation might depend on the level of description that we're employing when we're asking questions. So if I ask, why did that person leave the lecture 10 minutes ago? It wouldn't be appropriate to answer in terms of brain activity that was causing motor cortex activity, that was causing coordinated muscular motion that involved a trajectory that took her out of the room. The appropriate answer would be, she was just bored stiff, you know, so it all depends on context. That's very fast. There's a lot to say about the causal exclusion problem, but I'm just going to move on here. Now, there's another kind of problem under the heading of mental causation that I've been recently urging on my colleagues in philosophy, and this is one that has largely been not discussed in philosophy of mind, and I think it should be discussed. So I'm just going to mention it quickly. It's what I call the agent exclusion problem. It's a problem that's actually closely connected to the well-known issue of free will and determinism. But that issue is typically discussed in metaphysics and not in philosophy of mind. Here's what I've got in mind. It seems to me that the what it's like character of our experience is quite rich and quite diverse. There's not just plain old, rather raw and simple sensory experience, like pain and color experience and sound experience and smell. There is all that. But I think there's more to mental what it's likeness than that. In particular, it seems to me that it's pretty introspectively obvious once you just reflect on the fact that there's some distinctive what it's likeness to experiencing yourself as an agent, as a doer of deeds. And one way to get at it is to think about it in contrastive terms. How many people have seen the famous movie Dr. Strangelove? Right, Stanley Kubrick's brilliant movie, and maybe the most brilliant of many brilliant performances by the great Peter Sellers. But you might remember the scene where Dr. Strangelove is sitting there and he's getting really excited, and he can't help, because of his excitement, his arm keeps going up in this motion that's kind of terrifyingly like a kind of Heil Hitler salute, right? And this is obviously not something that he's doing willfully. In fact, he very much wants that it not happen, but it happens anyway. So there's a case of mental causation there. His excitement is causing his arm to go up, but it's not a case of agency or experience of agency. Quite the opposite. What he really doesn't want that to happen. Think about other things that you could describe as bodily motions, or at least bodily changes that are plausibly caused by mental states but are not experienced as your actions. I mean, for me, a vivid case, although it's not quite a case of motion, is the situation where you experience yourself blushing, right? Because we usually do, you can tell when you're blushing because you can feel the heat in your face. And, you realize you're blushing because you're embarrassed. And in fact, you really want to not blush because typically you're going to know that the fact that you were blushing is going to signal to other people that you're embarrassed about something. And of course, the very desire not to blush is apt to make you blush all the more. So here's a case of mental phenomena causing something physical, but it's not action. So I'm mentioning those cases in order to stress the contrast. There's a what it's like of experiencing yourself as the source of your action, right? You don't typically experience actions as caused by states of yourself. The way you experience blushing is caused by a state of embarrassment, or Dr. Strangelove experiences this as caused by a state of excitement. You experience your behaviors as emanating from you. On purpose typically, but emanating from you. And there's a palpable aspect of being able to do differently if you want to. There's a kind of what I could do otherwise aspect to it. So I think, given that this is the character of our ordinary experience, there are some philosophical questions that need to be faced. One is, what is required of the world in order for me to really be an agent of the kind that I experience myself as being? What is required, how do things have to be in order for my experience to be accurately representing myself to myself, as opposed to being a big illusion? That's one question. Second question, am I an agent of the kind that my experience represents myself to me as being? That's another one. These, I think, are important questions. One answer you might give to the first question is, and this connects it up now with the issue of free will and determinism. You might say, well, I experience myself as being unqualifiedly free, as being free in such a metaphysical libertarianism. Nothing other than me, myself, determines my actions. Laws of nature don't fix what I'm going to do. The prior state of the world, including the internal state of me, doesn't determine what I'm going to do. I do in a godlike way. You might think that that's how your experience does represent things to you. If you thought that, then I think you'd have some good reason to get worried about whether people really are agents of the kind they experience themselves to be. Because I think there's some very good evidence, much of it coming from science, that everything that we do is in principle causally explainable in terms of what's going on physically and chemically in our brains. So if what I just said is the right account of what it takes for our experience to be accurate, then there's good reason to believe that our experience is not accurate. We're not agents of the kind we experience ourselves to be, which could generate big worries concerning whether it's appropriate to praise and blame and hold people morally responsible. So I think there's a big issue that should be in philosophy of mind, the agent exclusion problem. I don't want to embrace the kind of view I just described. I would very much like to defend a different kind of view about what it takes for us to really have, what it takes for us to be the kind of agents that we experience ourselves to be. But I think the question of what the truth conditions of agentive experience are is a really important question. Okay, one more thing, and then I'm going to stop because I don't want to talk for longer than an hour, and that gives me about one more minute. Some agenda items for fans of materialist naturalism about the mental. Let me mention one principal agenda item that exercises me a lot. Thorin Alter is not here. I guess he couldn't be here. He told me in advance he probably would not be able to be here. He's in the philosophy department here. He's a very good philosopher of mind. And there's a theme that is important in his work that I'm extremely sympathetic to, namely that an adequate account of the mind and its place in nature should be one that fully respects the first-person perspective, the distinctive perspective we have on our own mental lives, fully respects the fact that there are all kinds of very rich, intrinsic, what-it's-like aspects to mentality. Really, in effect, an awful lot of materialist philosophy of mind doesn't do that. It leaves out, as I've said already, the the aspects of mentality that are so salient from the first person point of view, the what it's like aspects of mentality that somehow kind of present themselves directly to us in experience. I think that maybe we need to rethink the agenda for materialist philosophy of mind to try to give an account of why incorporating the first person point of view is somehow essential in order to even understand the relation between the mental and the physical. And what we need, but I don't know how to deliver, is a way of making the incorporation of the first person point of view jibe well with a scientific, a sort of thoroughly scientific, materialistic account of human beings. I was talking to him just yesterday, and he says he doesn't call himself a materialist. And that's because his project is in many ways so different from contemporary materialism. But I also told him that I'm aspiring to a picture like the one I just described, and he said, that's my picture. So he and I agree about what to aspire to. And what I would like is a way of making plausible the claim that a view that respects the first person and gives it an essential role in our overall account of the mind and its place in nature would still count as a form of materialism. Okay, let me stop with that.